We're going to move on to a new section called The Science of Reading, How the Brain Learns to Read. And I'm really excited to bring this content to you. I think it's really fascinating. So we talked about how our brains are wired to learn to speak. And there are regions of our brain for speaking, both for pronunciation and for sound, and accessing meaning. And what's very fascinating is that if you surround children with spoken language, they automatically learn to speak. Unless they have a learning disability, they will pick up language just by being surrounded by it. And they will learn to speak and learn the sounds of whatever language is being spoken to them around the world. It's also really fascinating. They've shown that babies under a year old can discriminate all the sounds in all the language of the world. Adults cannot do this. So under the age of 1, they can tell the difference between sounds that you can't tell the difference between. So that Russian E and E, they can hear the difference. But as they listen to the language or languages spoken to them, they narrow that group of sounds, and then they can no longer tell the difference between sounds that aren't in that language that are similar, that are close together. Does that make sense? It's really, really fascinating. One researcher says that baby brains are constantly taking statistics on sounds. And it's kind of like what we were talking about. The brain is really good at learning patterns. And so as the babies listen to language, they kind of figure out the patterns of that language, and then their brains become sensitized to those sounds. And there's a region of the brain that is activated with the sounds of the language. The pronunciation and the articulation of those sounds is in one region of the brain. And then, as they grow, those sounds become connected to meaning. And the meaning of those words are stored in other places in the brain. And so then the sounds ball becomes connected to the meaning ball. So it's just fascinating how the brain is wired to listen to sounds and then connect those sounds to meaning. So the question then becomes is the brain wired to learn to read, right? Because just by being surrounded by language, children will learn to speak. But if children are surrounded by books, will they learn to read? And the answer is no. They will not. Our brains are not wired for reading. Children learn to read by being taught. And it's super interesting in the brain science. So this is how the brain of a strong reader functions. And we're going to come back and break this down. But what I want you to understand is that strong readers read with the back left region of their brain. And the other thing I want you to notice is that there's an overlap here with the access to the meaning and the pronunciation that those babies have generated or young children have learned. Does that make sense? So something's connecting. You see that to already the same regions used for spoken language. But what else is interesting is when they do functional MRIs on people who are reading, who are strong readers and struggling readers, strong readers use this back left side, and reading connects into the spoken language system of the brain, and struggling readers use the front right side of their brain. They use completely different sides of their brain. So what is going on? Because in addition to this, researchers have found that IQ has very little bearing on reading ability. In fact, recently they've found that children who have difficulty learning to read often have above average IQs. So, what is happening? How does the brain learn to read? This is the really big question. A lot of this presentation is taken from the book and the research of reading the brain by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. There are many other books, many other research articles, many other neuroscience presentations, all pointing to the same thing. However, I've been really influenced by this book, so I wanted to share that with you. It's very fascinating to read it. Reading starts as a visual input This is the brain of a strong reader in this back left side. And then it moves to the region called the letterbox. Now, the letterbox is also called the visual word formation area, and this area is really, really important, and we're going to come back and explore it a little bit more. But for now, what I want you to see is this visual input goes to this area called the letterbox, which the brain recognizes letters here. And from that region of the brain, those letters then access the sounds. They can see these pathways forming, that it goes from letters to sounds, and then it goes from sounds to meaning. They can literally see this happening as they do the neuroscience research. So reading starts as this visual input, goes to the letterbox, they recognize that it's a letter, they then use that information to access the sounds, then they can use their auditory lexicons. So they already have, oh, the sounds ball mean ball. They can use that information to then access the meaning of that word. And again, neuroscience is very clear. This is what's happening. So what's also really interesting about this, and that's become very clear, is once an emerging reader knows the sound-to-letter correspondences, and by the way, this research is happening in many, many, many languages around the world. So we could replace the word phonogram sound correspondences just fine here. It's just what is the picture and what is the sound. They now know that an emerging reader can self-teach fluency just by reading. And that is also very clear in the research. Now, there's something else that's very interesting about the neuroscience is with practice, the brain can develop an additional route. And that additional route looks like this. You'll see it goes from vision, letterbox, to sound, to meaning, but with practice, they can go straight from the letterbox to meaning. Now, there's something super important to understand about this. They are not doing one or the other. They are doing both in parallel. The brain is amazing. So they are accessing sounds and meaning in parallel simultaneously. Does that make sense? It's really fascinating. And it's also very, very clear. You cannot develop this second route without first establishing this route and practicing it. Again, they know this. So, what does this mean? Something that we know as well is that beginning readers read serially. They read one phonogram at a time. I had soup for lunch. You've heard this. And so they hear those sounds, and then they use the sounds to connect that to the meaning area of the brain. But as they progress, reading serially goes away, and they begin to process in parallel. So when you see this sentence, I had soup for lunch, you feel like you've understood it as fast as you've read it. You feel like that even when you hear it, right? I had soup for lunch, you just get it. Well, it's through all that practice and the formation of these two pathways processing in parallel that we can read so fast. Just to emphasize, advanced readers read in parallel. They're processing all of the sounds and the meaning, so the letters and the sound correspondences and the meaning all at once. They are not reading whole words. Rather, there is just an illusion that they're reading whole words. But again, the neuroscience is clear. When they look at what the brain is doing, it's an illusion that it's whole words because we do it so fast. I mentioned this, but I think it's really important to reiterate. Fluency can be trained, and we're about to move into the fluency section of this presentation, but fluency can be trained by reading independently once students know the sound-letter correspondences. And you see this, right? With young students who grasp phonetics, they practice, they read, and they become more and more fluent. So let's go back to the letterbox region of the brain. I just think this is really interesting, super interesting. So what is this part of the brain originally for? If the brain is not wired to learn to read, that part of the brain actually has a different purpose in young children and in people who do not know how to read. The letterbox region of the brain is the same part of the brain that children or people who are illiterate use for facial recognition. Yeah, really. So this part of the brain in babies and toddlers and preschoolers is recognizing faces. And something that's fascinating is as a student learns to read, facial recognition gets displaced, and it goes to the right side of the brain. Because there's this plasticity in the brain where things can move around, well, facial recognition gets displaced, and it turns into this region called the letterbox that recognizes letters. But what we have to think about is a region of the brain that is for facial recognition is very sensitive to the fact that mirror images are the same. So think about it. If you are facing this way, the baby needs to recognize that when you're facing this way, it's the same person. In fact, something that's super interesting in my mind is that the letterbox region of the brain is the region of the brain that is most sensitive to the idea that mirror images are identical. Okay, what does that mean for beginning readers? Right? What does that mean? It means that that region of the brain sees these as what? The same. Isn't that interesting? Mixing these up is not dyslexia. This is true for all emerging readers. That part of the brain needs to be sensitized to the idea that mirror images are not the same. We need to unlearn this. In fact, you see this in young children's writing. Have you ever noticed that young children write forwards and backwards and up and down, and they mix it all up? Well, also think about this. Some writing goes left to right. Some languages write right to left. Some write top to bottom. It takes training of the brain to even know which direction the script you're learning is going to go. So this is a stage all young writers also go through, because they have to train the brain that there is a directionality to the language that they are reading. And research is becoming very clear that the way and the best way to change the letterbox region of the brain and sensitize it to directionality is through handwriting. So it's really, really interesting to see how all of this research is coming together. So in one study, researchers taught 4-year-olds the sounds of the alphabet. Now, they were able to do functional MRI studies on these 4-year-olds before they began the study and show that these children saw letters in the same part of the brain they saw shapes. So when you see a square and a rectangle or a circle or a shape, you don't use the letterbox region of your brain. Shapes are processed somewhere else. So these students saw these letters as shapes. They hadn't activated the letterbox yet. And they then divided the groups into groups they taught how to write the letters, groups they taught how to type the letters, groups that they said they just showed them, and groups that they traced. And they taught them over a period of 4 weeks. And in this particular study, there was no activation of the letterbox in any of the groups except the group that learned to write it. Very interesting. There are many studies, though, that show that handwriting activates the letterbox region of the brain. One researcher summarizes it like this: the motor experience of manually creating letter forms helps children discriminate the essential properties of each letter, which leads to more accurate representations, bolstering both skilled letter recognition and later reading fluency. So do you remember us talking about the brain being a really great pattern learner? Well, how does a child learn that this is a dog, and this is a dog, and this is a dog, and that's a dog, and that's a dog too. I mean, right? It's really remarkable that they can see these all as dogs, that all of these breeds are the same animal. I mean, if you stop to think about it, how would you even define this? But the brain is really good at this, and we don't even question that a young child can do this, right? Well, as I pointed out earlier, by writing, students began to realize what's important to make each of those letters, and what's not. Is it important if they reverse? Oh yes, they're different if they're reversed. Is it important if that line is taller? Oh yes, it is. Is it important if I put a little line across it? Nope, that's not. So it's through handwriting that they experience these differences, and theoretically that they understand. The other thing that they are finding, which is really interesting, is that children, as they all write it differently, right? And each time they write it, it's a little different. And the brain likes all those differences. And it goes, oh, that one's a little different from that, but it's the same. Just like those dogs. And that helps them to learn them faster and for that letterbox region to become activated. So writing is really key to activating the letterbox region of the brain. Another really interesting thing about the letterbox is, can you read this? But the letterbox is not sensitive to case. You can mix up upper and lower case, you can mix up fonts, and you can still read. It's a little bit slower, but you can still read it just fine. And what researchers are really showing through a lot of these neuroscience studies very, very clearly, and through demonstrations like this, is that word shape is completely irrelevant to reading. So activities like this, where you match the ascenders and the descenders to the word, are completely useless, because the brain does not use word shape. It uses letters to sounds, and then sounds to meaning, not word shape at all. So if you're using these, you have more time in your day now. Also, the letterbox region is only activated to the language that you've learned to read. So if you've been taught to read in that language, the letterbox is activated. Can anyone read this? In Chinese, it says, I had soup for lunch, however you would say that in Chinese. But your brain is not using the letterbox region to see that and process that if you don't know Chinese. It's using the area of your brain that sees shapes. Now, if you could read Chinese, it would be activating the letterbox region. And what else is very interesting is that every language in the world uses the same part of the brain. You would think with all this variety in scripts that maybe different languages would use different regions. They all use the letterbox and connect to sounds and then connect to meaning, and then eventually form two pathways. Very interesting, huh? I don't know if any of you have seen something like this. So first of all, the first clue that this is completely bogus is that it did not come from Cambridge University. It was an internet phenomenon that kind of went around for a while. And the person who wrote it, whoever that is, was very, very clever. Because what they did is they switched bigrams, which means they switched two letters. They didn't completely scramble words. And because the brain is really good at patterns and complex patterns, it can still sort it out. So that's why you can read it. It's not because only the first and the last letter matter. Not at all. And if you had only put the first and the last letter correctly and then put completely random letters in there, you can see it's complete. You wouldn't be able to read it at all. So, but that's a myth, right? That you hear people say, oh, reading's just about the first and the last letter of the word. No, it's not. The brain is brilliant at figuring out patterns, and that's why we can read misspellings, but there's a limit to that. Bigrams, the brain can do because it's so good at patterns. It's also interesting that when we teach someone to read, the brain actually changes in ways that neuroscientists can see. It builds fibrous channels, is what one researcher called it. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm just repeating that. But what they do say is that it changes the structure of the brain. And they can see that brain structure changing. And it does that by forming connections between letters and sounds. And it's, like I said, it's an anatomical change that researchers can see. They can see it too when they compare words like rain and plane. People who know how to read will actively, if you ask, do rain and plane rhyme because they're spelled differently, the brain will actually activate your letterbox region to check that out very quickly. And they can see that. Again, not in people who don't know how to read, but the brain changes how it even processes phonemes once you've learned how to read. They also now know very clearly, this is considered a closed science, that systematic teaching of grapheme to phoneme correspondences makes the fastest changes to the brain to become strong readers. And again, this is a closed science in neuroscience. It's often not making its way into education, but to me, the application of this is phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, it's just fascinating compared to what I was, say, taught in graduate school in my reading classes. So how do we know the brain is impacted? Well, MRI scans, functional MRI scans, can identify the neural pathways being developed in struggling readers versus strong readers. And they can even now do studies as they teach people to read using different methods. And that's extra fascinating. They took some adults, this is at Stanford. Again, this science is happening across laboratories around the world. And do you remember what I said? Good science is replicatable across many places and across time. This is happening around the world in many languages. But at Stanford, they did a really fascinating study where they took a group of adults and they taught them how to read whole words. So they taught them how to read in a new language, and they taught them to read whole words. A second group of adults, they taught them the letter-sound correspondences, and then taught them how to read words using those. Well, what was particularly fascinating about this study is that they were able to prove that these adults learning whole words activated the front right side of their brain. Do you remember what I said, how struggling readers read? That's how these adults being taught to read whole words read in their brain. And then the group of adults that were taught letter-sound correspondences, they showed it activated the letterbox region of their brain, connected to the sounds area of their brain, and then connected to meaning. Then they tested them. And yes, group one could read all of the words that they were given. However, surprise, surprise, group two could read lots of words that they were never explicitly taught. Which makes sense, right? Because they know the letter-sound correspondences, so they could rearrange those into new words. So one point is that when we learn letter-sound correspondences, we open up reading. And just thinking back, right, just to the 6-year-olds who have a 10,000-word vocabulary, this is the key to helping them read every word they already know. Because you can't teach them all by sight, right? That would be impossible. And the other really big takeaway here is that how we teach impacts the brain. And we can see that, and it makes a big difference. We can either train the brain activating the letterbox, or we can train the wrong part of the brain. It's very important to understand this. When students learn sight words rather than letter-sound correspondences, we are training the wrong part of the brain. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. So first of all, if you've taught sight words, please don't feel guilty because this is probably new information to you. I mean, it's new even to me in the sense of the weightiness of what it means in the brain science. And we can't teach what we don't know, but I do want you to think about it in terms of what you go back and also what you bring back to your schools. I mentioned this before, but reading in all languages requires connecting letters to speech sounds, all languages. Chinese as well. All languages are a balance of phonetics and morphology. And where that balance tips varies based on the spoken language and the needs of that spoken language. And teaching letter-sound correspondences in all languages is essential, and it's the fastest way to acquire reading and comprehension. And once those correspondences are learned, students can use those lexicons of meaning that they developed to recognize those words and to understand the meaning. So another study showed that in as little as 4 hours of phonogram games, matching phonograms to sounds that they could hear, the letterbox region was activated in 4-year-olds. Now, you're going to notice that this conflicts a bit with the handwriting research, because the handwriting research said that only the group that learned to write it activated the letterbox region. And from my overview at this point, I think it's a little bit inconclusive, but I think what we're going to find, this is my best guess, is that handwriting trains the letterbox faster. That still learning these, sound correspondences visually and playing games still trains it, but I think the experience of writing, they're going to show, speeds up that process. That's my guess, just based on the studies I've read, but they can show the letterbox being activated by students learning phonograms and their sounds. I also want us to think about the simple view of reading again. Decoding skills times oral language skills equal reading comprehension. Do you remember earlier I spoke about Allie? And she learned the phonograms, and all of a sudden she was reading novels. Wait, she didn't have to read little children's books? Why? Because as soon as she knew how to decode, she could use her oral language skills, whatever she could orally comprehend, and she could then comprehend at that level. Do you know what great news this is for our struggling readers? Think about that for a moment. You have a 5th or 6th grader who can comprehend orally on grade level, who's reading at a kindergarten or 1st grade level. What's missing? Decoding, foundational skills. Bring up foundational decoding skills, what can happen? It can be huge, yes. Now, I will qualify. There are kids who have auditory processing and other learning disabilities, but this is true for many, 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 many students, that their foundational decoding skills are what are lacking, or they haven't been taught how English really works. They've been taught kind of funny phonics that doesn't hold together, and so those decoding skills are really weak. They're not strong enough, but this is, I think, really hopeful. On the flip side, we have researchers such as Keith Stanovich at the University of Toronto showing that a 1st grader's reading level can predict their 11th grade reading level. Why is that? One, I think it's sad, but 2, I suspect it's because we teach almost all our foundational skills in 1st grade and then we stop. And so then if that student didn't master it or didn't get it thoroughly enough or didn't get enough of them, they're stuck. So this comes back to this analogy that I wanted to leave with you of we need to grow really deep roots in order to become strong learners where we build the rest of our education. What do we know? We know that teachers can do what brain surgeons cannot. Have you ever thought about that? That you as a teacher can rewire the brain through good instruction. Pretty powerful. We also know that it is considered a settled science. Researchers, scientists have known this for more than a decade, and it's just becoming clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer. And the nuances are becoming even clearer. Does that make sense? But we have known this, the neuroscience community has known this for a long time. We also know that there's no dispute among the researchers about how the brain learns to read, but that there is a gap in how a majority of schools teach and what the science says. And again, all I want to say is there's no guilt in this. It's just I want to help close that gap, and I'm hoping that you, as you gain this information, also want to help bridge that gap and to bring this to our classrooms and help our students succeed in reading. So, do you have any thoughts or questions? What was the most interesting aspect of the neuroscience summary for you?
Some of it kind of explains some of my misconceptions about whole language learning, which I think is probably misunderstood anyway, but I know that there are students who learn by whole language, but I never really understood what that meant, and I think now what I understand is that they just assimilated the phonetic and the morphemes and the phonograms so easily that they jumped really quickly into finding meaning in the whole word, and it looked like they were seeing the whole word, but really they just jumped really quickly into it for whatever reason.
Well, and I think I think what you're saying is really good. It's really powerful. And I think about these students, right, who when they misread is as is, and you say that's an exception, they just blow right past it and go, oh, that's is. But if we stop, we're like, wow, it's really close. And I don't think they noticed it. So they're able to, with a small amount of the phonetic code, make those connections well enough. But also I think it's interesting what they said is that IQ doesn't really relate to reading ability, and in fact some of the smartest students struggle the most with reading because I think they notice when we're teaching them a phonetics that doesn't work. They're the students who are like, oh, what? That's not what you told me. What? So I think that's fascinating too. Also, as you teach logic of English, you're going to notice something. Kids suddenly take off and read independently books that are not controlled by phonogram and spelling rule in all sorts of different spots in the curriculum. Some students will get through Foundations A and be picking up real books and reading them. Others need to get all the way to Foundation C and to the end when they have almost all the phonograms and rules to pick up real books and read them. Some are right in the middle of B. It happens, but I think we all need a little bit higher or lower percentage as we're building those pathways. Just maybe depending on how good we are at making guesses and intuiting in things, you know. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
After hearing Christy talk last fall, I was fascinated by this concept, and I just thank you for all that you shared today. I took as many notes as I could write. But I did some research on my own because I was so curious with the idea of the difference between seeing reading as pictures of the word versus hearing sounds. And one thing that I learned was that with strong readers, a lot of people, when they're reading silently, they hear themselves reading in their minds. And for struggling readers, they don't. It's silent. And I started kind of doing my own survey of my husband and other adults. I took it to my high school students. So the joke was that everybody was to go around and ask, do you hear voices in your head?
That's great.
It seemed like, as a general rule, those that were really fast, really fluent, very avid readers heard themselves speak, and sometimes even in character voices and with inflection, and those that were staring at pictures of words didn't get that experience.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I have something to show you with that thought too. So one of the book that I referenced is Reading in the Brain. But there's another book out that's even a little bit newer called Language at the Speed of Sight. And this one is actually, I think, out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he talks about how there's all these misconceptions about how people learn to read, and that the speed reading movement really had a lot of influence on our misconceptions, because speed reading would teach people to not hear what they're reading, just to skip ahead and not to articulate that in your mind. But that's not true. Strong readers do hear what they're reading, and we don't read that way. And we can't actually pick up as much meaning. They can show that people can skim and glean little bits, but you know, a lot of us skim looking for something, but skimming is not reading, right? It's very different. He is another researcher who's very passionate about bridging this gap between what neuroscience and linguistics is very clear about and what is happening in our classrooms. So I would say, too, his book is very readable. It's a great, it's fascinating.